It's been advertised everywhere. Suranne Jones is to play Anne Lister, who was a Halifax landowner and industrialist in the early 19th century. She lived at Shipton Hall, which is where the copious diaries she wrote were hidden and were only found in the late 1930s to reveal an extraordinary life. Lister had travelled widely, inherited the house and the business, was fearless in her choice of dress, wearing clothes more suited to a man than a woman in her time, and she wrote openly about her love for women. The more racy parts of the diary were written in code. In the first episode, to be shown on Sunday, we find Anne in bed with her married lover, Mariana Lawton, who's just suggested Anne's life would be easier if she got married.
No one knows you better than I do.
Then you do know that I could never marry a man. Not for any reason, under any circumstance. It'd be perverse. It'd be absurd.
But the reality is that
I thoroughly intend to live with someone I love. I thoroughly intend to spend my evening hour with someone who loves me. Someone who is there all of the time, to share everything with. Not someone who just drops in every now and then whenever an irritable husband permits it.
And the reality is that that will never happen. This is what you can't see. And until you do, you're going to keep on getting into scrapes with women like Via Hobart, and you're going to keep getting upset when they get married, which they will.
Lydia Leonard and Suranne Jones. Now, Anne Chomer, who joins us from Leeds, is the author of Gentleman Jack, the real Anne Lister, and Sally Wainwright has written the television series. Sally, how did you come to hear of Anne Lister?
Well, I grew up in Halifax, as you know, and I always visited Shipton Hall as a child. It was somewhere you were taken by my parents and on school trips, and it was somewhere I was always mesmerised by. It's a beautiful, magical place, and I always felt a real attachment to it, but I didn't know anything about Anne Lister. I only discovered Anne Lister, really, when I read Jill Liddington's book, Female Fortune, which was published in 1998, and I was just amazed that this extraordinary woman had owned this house that I'd always felt this real, connection and affection for. I'd started to pick up during the 90s that somebody extraordinary had owned Shibden, this woman who was transgressive. There was something interesting about her, but it was really hard to find out much about her up until I read Jill's book, and then retrospectively I read Helena Whitbread's work, which she'd published in the 1980s. But we're only really now starting to figure out who this fantastic woman was.
Now, Anne, how did you become interested in her?
Similar story, really, actually, Jenny, to Sally's, but I'm from Leeds, I'm not from Halifax, and so I didn't go to Shipton Hall as a child. I wished I had done, but similar to Sally, I was given a book by a friend, and it was Helena Whitbread's book of extracts called I Know My Own Heart, and that set me on my way to doing a university degree at Leeds University. And I did a master's degree and a thesis on Anne's diaries. So that was my initial interest, and that's when I started going to the archives and transcribing the diaries and looking at the letters myself and the vast Lister archive that's there.
Sally, how would you describe Anne?
There's almost too much to say about Anne. You kind of get it's where to start.
We're going to be here all morning, aren't we?
She was an extraordinary human being. She's known to us primarily as a prolific lesbian diarist. But when you get to know her, as I have done over the last 20 years, the thing that jumps out at you most is just how clever she was. She was a phenomenally intelligent woman. She was remarkably physically fit. She was a polymath. She was a great traveller, a great scholar. She was a great linguist. She became an industrialist. She sank her own coal mines. She studied the engineering behind coal mining. She didn't just pay other people to do it. One of the really fascinating things about her for me is that people have said, oh, she was rich. She could do all these things because she was rich. She wasn't rich. Shipton Hall is quite a modest estate, and she had to make it pay. She was always struggling to find the next £5, where the next hit of money would come from. The other great thing I love about her more than anything is she had such a positive attitude to life. Her life was for living. She had this brilliantly curious mind, and she was always doing about 10 things at once. She was a real force of nature, and she's really inspiring in that sense.
And there were an awful lot of diaries that she'd written over the years. What's the story of how they came to be hidden, then found, and then the code translated?
Oh gosh, that is a question, Jenny. In a nutshell, they were found behind a panel at Shibden Hall by the last ancestor of Shibden Hall, the last inhabitant, called John Lister. And he discovered the journals behind a panel, and with his friend Arthur Burrell set about trying to crack the code. They eventually did do that and discovered what the contents of the code was. And as soon as they realised that it contained sexual content of love between women, the diaries were hastily put back behind the panel. And in fact, Arthur Burrell, John Lister's learned friend, he wanted John Lister to burn the diaries, but he refused, and he recognised the value of this amazing document of Anne Lister's life.
So, Sally, why would you say her writing about her lesbian relationships is so significant? Because she did code it.
It's significant because it's the first time, it's the first record that lesbian relationships existed between women. It's the only record of that level of affection between women, because it was never illegal. It was beneath illegal. It was illegal for men, and so there are court records that men had sexual relationships. But because it was not illegal for women, there's not even court records. So when it was revealed what was in the code, it's the only record that level of intimacy actually existed between women.
And who were her lovers, and how open was she about what was going on? I know the writing was coded, but people must have known.
Yeah, I mean, they did know. Her first lover was Eliza Rain, who she met at the Manor House boarding school as a teenager in York. And from then on, she had subsequent relationships with Mariana Lawton, who was the main love of her life, really. And then Isabella Norcliffe before that. So she had various lovers in her life, not as many as people like to think she had. I mean, you sometimes read that she had scores of lovers, but she didn't in actual fact. You could actually count on one hand the significant lovers that she did have. She never veered from who she was, and she stood proud, against a world that was often cruel about the way she looked. But she did, she was careful enough to exercise and behave in a way that didn't countenance any kind of bad thoughts about her, or she was very, very careful to exercise discretion, and she actually behaved in a very discreet manner with the women that she was with.
But Sally, as a fellow Yorkshire woman, I mean, we're all three of us Yorkshire women, as was Anne, how surprised were you to find someone with the courage to live her life so boldly in Halifax?
She was extraordinarily courageous. I mean, she had the heart of a lion. She was very singular. She was able to live life by her own standards against all convention. I mean, she must have been a very unusual human being to have met. She was very charismatic. She was very clever, and I think she had to live life on her own terms because of her intellect. I think she probably met very few people who were quite on her intellectual level.
But what impact did learning about her have on your understanding of the history of Yorkshire, your home county?
It changed my attitude. I mean, I've always been a keen historian. I've always loved history. I've always been passionate about the past. But it certainly changed my attitude towards my hometown. I mean, I grew up there as a teenager who wanted to work in telly, so I couldn't wait to leave. I wanted to go and live in London because I thought that's where it all happened. And then when I discovered Anne Lister, my hometown suddenly became magical to me in a way that I could never have anticipated.
And how did she view her gender? Because I know she was often mistaken for a man, and she certainly dressed in a very masculine way, not particularly acceptable at that time.
Yeah, she was misgendered a lot, and I think I write in the book that she, once when she was travelling through France, that she was mistaken for a man 3 times in one day. I mean, what makes Anne Lister really modern is that she was debating notions of gender fluidity 200 years before anybody else was doing it. So she would often write in her diary, she'd write something like, she was neither man nor woman in society, or she'd see herself as like a connecting link. So I think she had a very, very healthy self-esteem about who she was, but she was having these debates within herself.
And in that first episode, which I've seen, she's very angry at the thought that women might not get the vote.
She's. It's interesting that she wasn't a great exponent of women's rights. You know, that just wasn't a discourse at the time. She was interested in her own rights primarily.
But when they're talking about the reform bill, she is cross in that first episode. That
yeah, she's quite sarcastic about the way the world is.
She is. Now, you say in your book, Anne, that she inherited Shibden Hall because she was a lesbian. Why do you say that?
I think I've kind of pushed the boundaries there, and I wanted to be a bit brave about what I was saying, because I think Anne Lister and her Uncle James and her Aunt Anne, they had a very, very unique, groundbreaking relationship with each other. And I think my understanding is that they had a tacit understanding of who she was and what her sexuality was. So I believe that Uncle James had a great understanding of her lesbian sexuality, that in fact they had conversations with each other, and she'd say, you know, I'm never going to marry, and he said, yes, I understand that. And she would often say things in the diaries like, you know, if I was other than I was, I wouldn't have got the estate. So I kind of pushed I pushed myself down and say that Aunt Anne and Uncle James were very, very understanding of who she was, and that there was nobody else really there that could have inherited the estate.
Sally, Suranne Jones plays Anne, and I know you worked with her on Scott and Bailey. Why did you think she would be the right person for the part?
Well, to begin with, I couldn't imagine who could be Anne, because there's just so much to her. There's so many facets to a character. It was really hard to, which is unusual for me. Normally, I have someone in mind, and I think initially I imagined Suranne she's a very contemporary looking woman, and I think that was partly why, to begin with, my mind hadn't gone to her. And in fact, ultimately, that was the thing that's made the performance most exciting, that she does have this very contemporary quality. I think what Suranne's got in common with Anne Lister hugely is a physical energy, a mental brilliance. I mean, Suranne has ideas popping out of her head all the time. And there's some really obvious... and she's very charismatic, of course. She's very... she's got this huge personality, and that's so Anne Lister.
Now, since we last spoke, you made To Walk Invisible about the Bronte sisters. What other northern women are you going to bring to the screen?
Well, I've just got very interested in Amy Johnson, who came from Hull. The aviatrix Amy Johnson, who had a very extraordinary life. And so that's... what I'm hoping to look at next.
Fine by me. I love you bringing all these northern women out. Sally Wainwright and Anne Chermer, thank you very much indeed, both of you, for talking to us this morning. And a reminder that the new series starts this Sunday evening. And I've seen one episode. It's well worth watching. Thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you.
Now, still to come.